Let me now briefly talk about testing and how it is applicable to Angular applications. Angular was built from the ground up to enable testing. Misko Hiveri, who designed Angular, was indeed a Google test engineer. And so you can see how his own experience with testing had a lot of impact on how Angular was designed. Angular is designed to be implemented in a modular fashion. You can see that Angular applications consist of controllers, filters, services, factories, providers, all interacting with each other to provide the functionality of your application. And the fact that you're using dependency injection in there, meaning that a module can be completely separate from the other module and the functionality of the other module can be injected into your module where required. This means that all this structure provides you with enough facilities to enable testing, as we will see next. This is where I should briefly mention to you about test-driven development. In test-driven development, so the whole idea is that when you have some functionality to be implemented, you write an automated test case to test that functionality, to specify the desired functionality. Thereafter, you write code to pass the test, essentially meaning that the test controls to ensure that your code that you write, the application code that you write, will meet the test requirements. Now, of course, after it passes the test, then you might use strategies for refactoring the code to satisfy coding standards. But once you know that your code passes the test, then you can always retest your code, even if you make modifications to the code, to ensure that it still passes those tests. So test-driven development has increasingly received a lot of attention in the software engineering area. In particular, let me talk about unit testing. Unit testing means testing individual units of code. Angular is a very good example of where you have units automatically available for you. You have controllers, you have filters, you have factories, you have services. These are units of code that could be tested in isolation to ensure that they are meeting the needs or they are implementing the logic correctly. So in addition, Angular enables you to do dependency injection, whereby if a module is dependent on another module, you can easily inject a mock dependencies into that module to carry out the tests. So that enables unit testing very effectively in Angular. So there is a clear separation in Angular also between the DOM and the code because of the use of scope. You realize that controllers don't directly manipulate the DOM. Instead, controllers put their data onto the scope, and then that in turn, through Angular, takes care of reflecting changes to the DOM and vice versa. So this separation enables easy testing of your various modules within your Angular application. This is where Jasmine, a behavior-driven development framework for JavaScript, is very, very useful to express your Angular tests. So this is used to test Angular applications. We use the describe function in Jasmine to group our tests, and then we use the it function in order to define individual tests. Now, this may not make much sense to you at this moment. Let's look at an example to understand how we are making use of this to describe our Angular tests. Here is an example to illustrate how you would test the menu controller within your Angular application that you have been developing so far. So here you can see that I have describe and a function implemented there. So this function says that I am testing the menu controller. Now inside there, you can see that I have specified a test using the it. And the it is followed by a statement, which is nothing but a string there. It says it should create dishes with 2 dishes fetched from the XHR. Now this test is exactly testing that functionality. So when this test is executed, you will have to set up a few things in ahead of carrying out this test. But then when the test executes, these test cases should be satisfied. Now, how do you set up for the test? That I will talk about when we discuss Angular mocks. Now here, what exactly are we carrying out in this test? In this test, we are ensuring to check that the show menu on the scope is true. So that is tested by using the statement expect show menu to be truthy. So this is Jasmine's way of specifying that value should be true. Similarly, I say expect scope dishes to be defined, meaning that this variable should exist. And the third test, we are specifying expect scope dishes length to be 2. Now in this case, if I set up the mock dependency to return me a JavaScript object containing 2 items, then I would be able to ensure that this test passes. So setting up the environment for carrying out this test should ensure that actually the value delivered here will be 2 JavaScript objects here. So that setup we will discuss next. And also in the exercise that follows this lecture, you will actually use exactly this code to carry out test on the menu controller. Karma is a JavaScript-based command line tool which is written as a Node.js application. So it is written in JavaScript. Now what Karma enables you to do is to specify your tests using Jasmine, and then Karma will spawn a web server and automatically load your application's code and the tests and carry out the test in your browser. And then it will be able to produce the result at the end of your tests, whether your code passed the tests or failed some of the tests. So using Karma, you can easily carry out tests. Not only that, Karma can be set up to be continuously running in the background and be able to carry out tests when necessary. Now, this is where if you have a colleague that insists that his or her code is perfect and is working correctly, then you could easily write a few tests and then run them on his or her code using Karma. And if the test fails, you can always claim, my Karma ran over your dogma. As you realized, in Angular, many of your modules are dependent on other modules. Not only that, many of your components like the controllers, the services may be dependent on other services or other components that are implemented within your Angular application. Now, when you're carrying out tests, you may wish to mark out some of those components so that you supply predetermined data just to carry out your Angular test. And also, this is where Angular mocks or the Angular ngMock module comes to your rescue. This module provides you with a lot of interesting features that enables you to carry out Angular tests. One feature in particular is the HTTP backend, which enables you to mock a backend server and be able to send in data, pre-configured data, to your application and carry out tests on your application. Let's look at an example of how you would configure a test before carrying it out using Angular mocks. Here we have an example of using Angular mocks. Now in this case, before we carry out the test, so anything that needs to be configured before carrying out a test can be specified by using this method called as before each. This method takes a parameter which will be set up before the test is actually carried out. So here we are specifying that before each module confusion app. So this creates the module confusion app is actually a shortened form of Angular mocks module, which creates a mock module inside which your controller can be tested. We are using this code for testing our menu controller. Now here, we are specifying that a module needs to be set up. And also I have specified a few variables that I'm going to create while carrying out the test. Not only that, before carrying out the test, we're going to inject some mock components into place. So that is where we make use of the inject function that is provided by Angular mocks. So to do that, we would say before each inject function, and then in the parameters you see me using $controller and then underscore HTTP backend underscore and root scope and menu factory. This is where we are specifying all the modules on which this particular controller is dependent on. So for the menu controller, we already know that the menu controller needs the scope and the menu factory to be able to function correctly. And the menu controller through the service is accessing a backend server, which is supposed to return some JSON data. So within the before each function, I am configuring HTTP backend to be equal to underscore HTTP backend underscore. Now this underscores before and after the HTTP backend. When you configure and carry out the test, those underscores will be ignored, and that will be equated to the Angular mock HTTP backend. And then the next statement is configuring HTTP backend expect get, and then within parentheses we are supplying a URL there. So what this is specifying to the Angular mocks is that if you receive a GET request for this particular URL, then you respond with the data contained in the respond method that is attached to it, that is chained to it there. Now, inside the response method, you can supply your JavaScript object array that is going to be returned when this call is issued. So when your controller issues a call to the menu factory service, that menu factory service issues a call to the backend, and that will be mocked by this HTTP backend that we have implemented here. And this will return some mock data back to your controller through the menu factory. Now, when the data comes into your controller can then use the data, and then it is going to put that onto scope dishes and then be able to access the data. So here also we are creating a scope for our controller to work with. So to do that, we are saying scope is equal to root scope.new. This allows you to create a mock scope for your controller to use. Thereafter, we are configuring the menu controller using the $controller. So this is the way you would specify the controller in your Angular testing. So you say menu controller is $controller, and you specify the controller that you're testing, and then parameters. So the menu controller takes two parameters, the scope and the menu factory. So those two parameters are specified there. $scope is scope, the scope variable that we just created, the mock scope that we just created, and menu factory is the parameter that we got in. Now the last statement here says HTTP backend flush. When this is called, any requests that are pending at the mock HTTP backend will be flushed out. So the data will be sent off to the server. So you can immediately push the data to the server. So this way, the data is available for your controller to be tested immediately. So this configuration needs to be done before you carry out all the tests that we have set up for your Angular controller, the menu controller. We're going to look at this in the exercise that follows this lecture. We'll now move to our next exercise, where we are going to do unit testing of our Angular application. In particular, we will test the menu controller to understand how Angular testing can be done. So we will configure the Karma with a configuration file. Thereafter, we will write our unit tests using Jasmine and carry out the unit test automatically.